Hello, welcome to this recorded session, Neuroscience and Giftedness, Implications for Learning and Motivation. I'm going to share my slides shortly. I just want to tell you a little bit about the session and a little bit about myself. I'm Pam Clinkenbeard. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I'm a board member and past president of the Wisconsin Association for Talented and Gifted. This talk was developed for educators and psychologists interested in gifted and talented children, but I think that parents and researchers will find some benefit from it as well. I've got a lot of resources and references in a handout that was posted along with this video, so it should be on the same site. And you can always contact me for more information. I've got my email in several places. This talk is in the strand that's called Evidence-Based Curriculum and Instruction. And I'll be focusing on the neuroscience evidence for certain strategies and practices, and also the lack of evidence for others. Besides just being fascinated by brain research, I've been focusing for several years now on trying to be a sort of translator between neuroscience and practitioners. So I hope that this is helpful in some way along those lines. Okay, I'm going to share slides. And we'll start from the beginning. I think we're good. Okay, neuroscience and giftedness. And I really did want to share the implications of that whole field for learning and for motivation. I also want to my email address is there too, clinkenp@uww.edu. I also want to credit my colleague, Dr. Erin Miller. She is a cognitive psychologist and gifted education scholar at Bridgewater College at the University of Virginia, and we co-developed some of these materials. So these are the 5 main topics that I'd like to touch on during this 30 to 40 minute recording. Background and context. Just a little background for why I and we are interested in this topic in the first place, and a little bit of the history of it. Then I'll give a very brief overview of neuroscience basics, sort of a neuroscience 101, but that's mostly, I'm not doing a lot with like, this is the brain, these are neurons, here's an axon and a dendrite. I have listed a lot of links and resources where you can go find information on some of the brain basics. There's a lot of kid materials too, neuroscience for kids. Third, Neuro Myths and Facts. I'm going to give you sort of a quiz, a self-quiz on Neuro Myths. Let's see. Then I'm going to talk about neuroplasticity, what it is and why I think it's super important, especially for talent development perspectives and gifted education. And then finally, I'll wrap up by mentioning some of the many areas where research in neuroscience might have implications for gifted education. And again, if you have questions toward the end of the slides and on the handout, I have a number of resources and references as well as my email address. So feel free to contact me. Okay, so background and context. There has been an explosion of neuroscience in the past decade. And although I've targeted this session for educators and psychologists, it's also sort of a consumer protection warning. Including for parents and researchers. And one reason I wanted to do this talk is that I wanted to explore and share what the research actually means for teaching and parenting. Along with that explosion in research has been a huge proliferation of brain-based, I'm going to put that in air quotes, brain-based products and services. So this is a little bit of a consumer protection warning, a sort of buyer beware. There's an awful lot of stuff out there, books, websites, curriculum, and apps that are supposedly brain-based, but often they're not actually based on neuroscience research per se. The over-application of neuroscience research to education is a well-documented problem. It's actually the genesis of the field that's called mind, brain, and education in the US. Also in the US and in other countries, it's known as educational neuroscience. In our opinion, teachers and parents have enough to do without worrying about whether they are teaching or parenting in a way that is truly brain-based. Erin Miller and I recently published an article on this in Parenting for High Potential. I think it was the June 2021 issue. You may know that as NAGC's magazine for parents. So in 2008, there was a special issue of the Roper Review Journal, and some of the issues they raised back then are still pertinent today. So a few major long-term topics. First topic is, we know less than you might think. We know a lot about the brain from various laboratory studies, but that doesn't necessarily translate to evidence-based practice on how to teach or how to parent. Second, special populations research. Neuroscience has been looking at twice exceptional students for ages. There's a lot out there. There are many studies that look at especially ADHD or students who are gifted but on the autism spectrum. Also, there are studies on physiological definitions of intelligence or cognitive processing. So a lot of the neuroscience studies out there in the past and currently have focused on when kids are working on a particular task, where in the brain is that happening? You can see it lighting up. And then also speed of processing. So how efficient are kids processing? There are some studies that compare gifted students with students of average IQ, and IQ usually is the way that subjects are identified for those studies. So with all the problems related to that. But location and speed are two of the metrics in neuroscience research. And then finally, of course, the technology of examining the brain continues to develop at a rapid pace. One of the most frequent technologies that's currently used is functional MRI. So that's not a static picture, that's a moving picture of what's happening in the brain when someone is working on a particular task or carrying out a particular activity. So those are some of the long-term topics. Here are some of the newer topics and perhaps implications of neuroscience research, especially implications for gifted education. Executive functions, as you probably know, are the kind of skills that allow students to succeed both academically and socially. They're things like being able to focus on relevant information and ignoring distractions. The ability to delay gratification. If you know that marshmallow test, that's an example of delaying gratification, or how to measure delay of gratification. And also the ability to change focus as the demands of the task change. The big takeaway from neuroscience research with regard to executive functions is that they can improve with training. And that can allow for better school performance, both academically and with peers. The second point is about talent development and equity. I'll say a little bit more about this when I'm talking about neuroplasticity, but the main point here is that early experiences matter. The brain affects learning ability, but learning also affects the brain, so experience matters. I wrote a chapter in a book called Malleable Minds that elaborates on this quite a bit. Malleable Minds was published by a group including NAGC, the National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented, and the American Psychological Association. Finally, as far as newer topics goes, I cannot stress enough the critical importance of appropriate challenge. So brain growth, with implications for brain growth and usefulness for advocacy. So in study after study, neuroscience research shows that the brain develops increased density and new neural connections only when it's challenged, only when the task is appropriately challenging. when it requires some effort or some struggle to accomplish. I often use a weightlifting metaphor for that. You know, your muscles don't get stronger unless you lift more and more difficult weights. Also, I do a lot of advocacy work in Wisconsin and some nationally. And I share this information when I'm working with schools and legislators and other policymakers to try to persuade them that if they really want all children to grow and flourish, the children need programming that challenges them at the level where they are currently functioning, even if that level is far beyond their current grade level. So appropriate challenge is necessary for optimal brain growth. So that's sort of background and context. Here's just a little bit of Neuroscience 101, some concepts and information. I'm not going to give you, as I said, a basic lesson on the parts of the brain and how electrical signals travel through it. But I have provided a number of links and sources where you can learn more about Neuroscience 101 information. As I mentioned earlier, part of the problem with trying to base gifted education practices on brain research is that there's a really big leap between basic research on neurons in the brain and actual classroom cognition and behaviors. So that's a big jump. There are lots of unwarranted conclusions popping up out there for which there really isn't any clear and compelling research evidence. The details of this are not important, so don't worry about that. I'll be glad to send this table to you if you like. I developed it. That last column, my picture might be blocking. The header for that column is purpose. So this is a rough table of classification showing 4 levels of educational neuroscience research. Not all research in the general domain takes place in laboratories with brain scans and other neuroimaging research. Much of the brain-based advice that I mentioned earlier is not actually based on direct, like actually wiring somebody up and seeing what's going on in their brain. Sometimes, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all bad advice though. Sometimes direct neuroscience research confirms applied research or classroom research. And it may confirm what experienced teachers, other educators, and parents know about best practice. So even though only the bottom level here has to do with, sorry, lost my place for a second. So even though the bottom level here takes place in actual laboratories with subjects, for instance, receiving functional MRIs, fMRIs, they're all considered important for providing evidence about the neuroscience foundation of education practice. So just quickly, so on the 4th level down, neuroscience, usually called, takes place in neuroscience laboratories. The methods used are usually electrical imaging or electrical measurement of actual brain signals, brain activity. And the purpose is to discover new brain connections and to map neurological evidence and explanations for things that we may already believe or know about pedagogy, about educational outcomes. The next level up, and this goes from basic at the bottom to the most applied at the top. So the next level up is cognitive psychology, often called the science of learning now. And that usually takes place again at universities and psychology labs, but it usually does not involve brain imaging. It's more behavioral observations of humans or animals. And it's to test neuroscience principles in ways other than mapping, literally mapping brain activity. Then there is larger scale education and educational psychology research. RCT stands for randomized control trials. So kind of the gold standard of educational research. You have an experimental group and you have a control group, and we're going to provide something to the experimental group to see if there are differences in the outcome between the 2 groups. That's done often, actually, that's done with undergrads because frankly, they're handy. More and more that research is done in actual schools. Usually the methods are large-scale behavioral observations. And it's to test neuroscience principles in education settings with a very rigorous methodology. And then finally at the top, it's evidence-based teacher research or educational practice that is evidence-based. Location in the teacher's own classroom or the school building. We might call that action research or quasi-experimental research or other very hands-on kind of authentic context research. And that's basically to try out neuroscience principles in everyday practice. Does it really pan out when you're working with kids? Neuroscience says this, I'm going to try it in my classroom in a systematic and somewhat controlled way and see if it really does seem to lead to the outcomes that I'm interested in. So this is just sort of my own concept map in a way of the types of research that end up being called educational neuroscience or mind, brain, and education research. These are just a few findings for which there is some clear neuroscience evidence. And I put them in sort of conversational language. So first, your parents were right. Perhaps it was your grandparents. Hard work really does pay off. Brain growth happens with hard mental work, but it helps if you're working on something that you care about at a level that is appropriately challenging. So there's solid neuroscience evidence for that. The second one, neuroplasticity, is real. Your brain really does change throughout your life, and you can influence some of those changes. And for positive or negative, use it or lose it, really, there is real evidence for use it or lose it. And then finally, I talked about implications for learning and motivation. Intelligence and motivation interact in a lot of different ways, and there's some neuroscience research underpinning some of that. Flow example, if you know Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow, working hard at something that is appropriately challenging, like advanced or accelerated study, makes you literally smarter. So you actually have brain growth from doing that. And mindset related to Dweck, not just Dweck, but a mindset example, your views about your own intelligence actually affect your motivation to learn more. There's a little bit of neuroscience behind Dweck. It's usually other authors and more broad, but I just think it's fascinating that intelligence and motivation interact, each affects the other in different ways, and there's some brain research underlying that. Okay, so we've done a little bit with Neuroscience 101. We came from background and context. This little section is going to be about neuro myths and also neuro facts. So speaking of evidence, there's this whole research field about brain beliefs for which there's actually not evidence. So neuromyths are beliefs about the brain that are incorrect. They're quite widespread, even among educators. So there's a lot of research on neuromyths, which is really interesting stuff. Research has shown that many commonly held beliefs about learning in the brain are actually false, or at least much more complicated than you might think. Okay, I'm going to give you a little self-quiz. True or false? And I'm just going to fly all 4 of these up here. And if you want to take this as a self-quiz, just pause the video for a little bit and write true or false for each one. I will give the answers in the next slide, which I am going to move to right now. So if you want to wait, be sure to pause right now and then restart, and you can see the answers in the next slide. So, as you might have suspected, all 4 of the neuromyths are false. Oh, they were all actually neuromyths rather than neurofacts. So there's a lot of research on neuromyths, and these are 4 of the popular ones that show up in that literature. We use only 10% of our brain. I do not know where that originated. And if you know, I have looked. If you know, I would really appreciate knowing where that came from originally. It's sort of like that thing about spinach and iron, spinach giving you strength. It was all based on some long ago error where somebody had a decimal point in the wrong place. Spinach isn't nearly as nutritious as we all thought for, Popeye, the whole Popeye thing. So we use only 10% of our brain. In fact, we use pretty much all of our brain. We just don't use all of it at once for any one task, but things are popping all over the brain. So we don't use just 10% of it at any time or place. We may at some specific time or place, but we basically use all of our brain over the course of a day or a week. Let's see. Left brain versus right brain. We all love it. We all use it. I say that all the time, popularly speaking. Hemispheric lateralization explains differences in learning. This is not true. There is no research evidence for this. So it's true that somewhat different areas of the brain light up when we're doing analytic tasks versus doing creative tasks, but we use both sides of our brain for virtually any task, at least a little bit. And the data just do not support that this leads to any particular preferred method of teaching. So sorry if you like left brain, right brain. Brain development is complete by end of puberty. Those of us who took a lot of child or adolescent development in school or grad school, we may be inclined to think that intellectual development ends with Piaget's formal operational stage, so about ages 12 to 18. But quite a bit of the neuroplasticity research has actually taken place with geriatric populations. So again, the brain develops throughout life and you can improve brain function at any age. And finally, this kind of goes back to the consumer protection warning, the buyer beware. Brain games, the Mozart effect, other highly touted exercises or products to increase intelligence really don't work that way. They don't work to increase general intelligence. If you play a lot of Sudoku, you get better at Sudoku, but you don't increase your general cognitive functioning. So one activity that does show promise for the improvement of general cognitive functioning is, and sorry, it's aerobic exercise. And I say sorry for those of us who don't love exercise, but just do it because we know we should. Apologies if you can hear my landline ringing in the background. I used to have a lot of physical education majors in my educational psychology classes, and I made sure they were aware of this finding about aerobic exercise, especially in the face of cuts to physical education classes, gym teachers, and so forth, so that they could argue more effectively for keeping those things part of school. So those were some neuro myths. Here are some neuro facts. 5 physiological preconditions for optimal brain development and learning. In terms of both parenting and teaching, these are probably areas that are worth the investment of time and resources. In 2018, the Aspen Institute supported a commission on social, emotional, and academic development, and they produced the report that included these 5 preconditions for optimal brain development. One of the main points of the report is that in addition to the basic physiological resources like sleep, nutrition, and exercise, optimal brain development requires quality social relationships and emotional experiences. This list also brings up issues related to poverty and equity. Children of poverty may be less likely to receive nurturing levels of most or all of these preconditions. I just heard a report yesterday on how much lead paint is still out there in older homes, especially in urban areas, and how it's still affecting children's neurological development, decades after that connection was understood. With regard to equity, cultural well-being and belongingness are important. It's important to know that your culture is respected and that you are an important part of the classroom or family team. Okay, beyond neuromyths, now we're looking at neuroplasticity briefly. And neuroplasticity, this is sort of on the positive side of brain research, refers to the ability of the brain to adapt and improve. We all have malleable or plastic, used in that way. We all have malleable brains and we can all get smarter, but young children's brains are particularly malleable. There's research evidence that we can teach and nurture young students in ways that will raise the skills and performance of many more of them to gifted levels. So this really argues for a talent development perspective for gifted education. One of the main points here is that experience matters. Again, the brain affects learning, but learning also affects the brain. You can get smarter. Learning affects both the structure and the function of the brain. So it can develop new connections and the efficiency and speed of those connections can improve. I mentioned executive functions research earlier. I really think that that's important. It gives me hope and also a rationale. I think it gives all of us a rationale for early screening, universal consideration. Finding kids early and giving them advanced opportunities and developing skills as well as just looking for pre-existing skills. There's strong research foundation for teaching executive functions and from a framework of seeing underrepresented students as at promise rather than at risk. So brain malleability is real, plasticity is real. Other areas and resources. So there are a lot of other areas related to gifted education, topics of interest to gifted education, where neuroscience research has found interesting and helpful outcomes. 3 of them are twice exceptionality, creativity, and social emotional development. And what I've done is provide just one really good source for each of those. And each of these links then has a lot of other sources that you can explore. With regard to twice exceptionality, the Bell and Blank Center at the University of Iowa is doing really interesting research in cooperation with the Iowa Neuroscience Institute. Maybe some of you participated. They had a virtual summit in May of 2021 about twice exceptionality and neuroscience research. It was really fascinating. Also, I know that the CTD, the Center for Talent Development at Northwestern, has done some collaboration with the neuroscientists on their campus. So the first link is to the Bell and Blank Center, specifically to some of that neuroscience collaborative research. The second link, when I first started looking at neuroscience and giftedness many years ago now, I was just delighted to find that there's a Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity. There's a larger Society for Neuroscience, SFN, but this one is specifically for the neuroscience of creativity. And some of that research is just really fascinating. I love jazz music. And one of my favorite studies that is talked about on this site is jazz musicians' brains light up in different places when they are simply playing off of sheet music versus when they're improvising. There's a well-known study in that field by Lamb that shows that they actually turn off the self-censor section in the front of their brains when they're improvising, and they just kind of go with the flow. They improvise when they improvise. So neuroscience evidence for a particular type of behavior in music. Finally, there's a research center. There are researchers who specialize in the neuroscience of emotion and social emotional development. One of those is at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's called the Center for Healthy Minds. And the director of that is Richard Davidson. He's the person who convinced the Dalai Lama to allow Buddhist monks to get wired up so that the center could do research, neuroscience research on meditation. And he's actually friends with the Dalai Lama. They have this website, the Center for Healthy Minds, and they have a nonprofit offshoot also. They have a lot of materials related to teachers and kids. So social emotional development in the classroom, there's a lot of good stuff at this site. This is related to social emotional development and social emotional needs. This is a photo of Dessa. That's her stage name. Dessa is a writer and a musician. You might have heard her rap song about Janet Yellen. Yes, she created a rap song about US Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. You can find it on YouTube. It was all over YouTube earlier this year. So Dessa wrote a book, partly autobiographical, and it's called My Own Devices. And in that book, she relates a time in her life when she investigated and then tried neurofeedback as a form of therapy. Neurofeedback. She had no background in that, but she was clearly a gifted child reading her book. And she just went and self-taught about neurofeedback and found a psychologist who was willing to try it with her. So the issue was she had been obsessed with sadness about a previous relationship, and she just couldn't seem to get over the guy. So the jury is still out on neurofeedback as therapy. The research evidence is a little thin, at least the RCT, randomized control trials research, but clinical and anecdotal reports, including Dessa's own report, indicate that some clients and patients believe that they have been able to change their brain patterns in order to weaken or lose their negative emotions. So I find that really fascinating. And the mechanism of how that works reminds me of years ago, decades ago, when I was an undergraduate. I worked in a biofeedback lab, and we would glue electrodes all over the client's scalps, and they would work on either increasing or reducing a series of beeps just by concentrating on it. So often it was anxiety related, and they'd be connected to a machine that was doing these beeps, and it would be reflective of a particular type of brainwave. And we would have them try to slow down the beeps of brainwaves that typified anxiety and increase the beeps for brainwaves that typified more relaxation or sort of relaxed cognition. So neurofeedback, about which I am not an expert, I believe works with some of the same principles and some of the same mechanisms. Finally, here are 4 websites where you can learn a great deal more about general educational neuroscience. So there's neuroscience on the most general end. These are all about educational neuroscience, or mind, brain, and education. And then there are specific research studies on the education of gifted students and neuroscience. So this is kind of in the middle here. IMBES, IMBES, they publish the journal called Mind, Brain, and Education. And they're hoping to have their next conference in person in Montreal in July 2022. Early is the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. If you know AERA, they're sort of like the AERA for Europe. They have a special interest group, SIG22, on neuroscience and education, and they are co-sponsoring that Montreal conference with IMBIS. The Center for Educational Neuroscience in the United Kingdom, it's based in London, but they have a lot of satellite sites. They have a lot of interesting teacher-oriented resources, and they have also sponsored teacher research on the applications of neuroscience, like action research. And then finally, the Annenberg site is actually a full neuroscience course, and it has videos and instructional materials. And here are just 3 more takeaways from this particular talk. So making the most of your brain based on neuroscience evidence. So first of all, and for your children and for you, appropriate challenge is necessary for optimal intellectual development. And again, I use that for both for programming and for advocacy. I want policymakers to know that it's really critical if they're hoping that all children grow and learn. Appropriate challenge is necessary, and there's a lot of brain research behind that. The second takeaway is a focus on growth and learning. This is kind of related to mindset. It's more likely that anxiety will get in the way if you're more focused on performance and competition. I did a study many years ago that indicated that if the task you're working on is too easy for you, it really doesn't matter. About anxiety doesn't matter much. You've kind of overlearned it and you can do it whether you're stressed out or not. But if the task is appropriately challenging, anxiety can get in the way. So a focus on growth and learning more than performance and competition is probably a more brain-friendly way to go. So we might ask each other or ask the kids, what did you learn? As opposed to what did you get? Or, did you come out with the best grade? And finally, this is related to the first one again, but students need the opportunity to actually put forth effort. I used to run a lot of summer programs for gifted children. And one of the things we noticed was that kids kind of lacked study skills when they were presented with challenging material. They just didn't know how to handle it because they had not really had the opportunity to be appropriately challenged. So students need the opportunity to put forth effort in areas both of their strength and areas that they're interested in. So I thank you for viewing this video, and I would welcome any contact or questions that you might have at that email address. I will stop sharing now and end the video. Thank you very much.